Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Got to get our principal to quiet down a little bit, so, you know. I'm Cindy Rivera. I'm the Director of Guidance here. Thank you all for coming. We started having this program for sophomores last year because the whole testing thing has become a little more involved and a little more complex as ACT has become a viable alternative to the SAT in this area. So the choices you have to make as you move into junior and senior year, as your child does, I guess you've done it already, so, but as your child moves into junior and senior year, it has become a little more things to think about. So we started this last year to start to explain the differences between the ACT and the SAT to help you decide with your child, how do I make this choice for them? What is best for them? What do all these terms mean? Well, there's just so much to think about. So, this has worked well for us, so I'm glad to see so many people here. Today we have with us Charlie O'Hearn from Summit Educational. Even more importantly, he's a graduate of New Canaan High School, so we like to show him off a little bit, as well as Yale. He graduated from there. He is an expert in this field. He's written a lot of books around this and speaks all over the place around this very subject. So please welcome Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Thanks to the New Canaan High School Guidance Department for having me here. I really appreciate it. It is always fun to come back, and inevitably, just because we're all, well, whatever, roughly the same age, I see people I know, which is just a lot of fun. Thanks to everybody here for being here. As a parent myself, I know it's not always the easiest thing to motivate for these things, particularly such an exciting subject as standardized testing. So I am definitely grateful for you guys being here. Given that most of you, so I graduated from the high school in '84, my experience around standardized testing was probably much like yours. I didn't do any test prep aside from buying a Barron's book and studying about 30 words and then giving up. I can assure you my parents never once attended a standardized testing presentation here, much less my sophomore year. So things have definitely, as Cindy referenced, gotten more complicated. There are more moving parts. It probably all starts with college admissions just being more competitive, and it is. You know, I say, so I went to Yale. I did play basketball here and was recruited. I like to think back then I could have gotten into Yale without the basketball. I'm fairly certain that now, without the basketball, I couldn't get in. So I think as parents, that is important to keep in mind. So because things are more complicated, it's important to have a testing plan. And I'm going to dump a lot of information on you guys this morning. I don't expect you to remember much of it, but I think the one important takeaway is the importance of having a testing plan. And a testing plan is not this super complicated thing. Basically, it's which tests should I take, when should I take them, and how and when should I prepare for them. So which tests, when do I take them, how and when do I get ready for them? That's it. So the goal today, my hope today, is that it's not to ratchet up the anxiety. There's plenty of that. It's to give you a good head start on creating an appropriate, thoughtful, sensible testing plan. And that's why you're here as sophomore parents. It's a good time to be thinking about it. There's not a lot to do at this point, but it's a good time to be thinking about it. And you're fortunate enough to have really talented New Canaan High School guidance department and guidance staff to help you to create a testing plan. And we, of course, are more than willing to help you as well, to to come up with a testing plan as well. But that's really the main takeaway. And the last thing I want to say about a testing plan is there is no one right testing plan. I wish there were, but there's not. But there most likely is a testing plan that is best for your situation. And that's what I want you thinking about as we go through this. When we talk about which tests, college admissions tests, these are basically the tests we're talking about. So the PSAT is the least important of all of these tests and does not count in the college admissions process. So admissions officers are not going to see your PSAT scores. SAT and ACT are the most important, and it's likely that your students will take one of these tests at least twice. It's possible that your students will take both of these tests before all is said and done. Subject tests, I think, lead to the most confusion among all of these. I'll cover those just real quickly in a bit. And then AP tests we're not gonna get into today. The gist of today is gonna be sort of SAT versus ACT, because for you as parents, how many parents here took the ACT? So we have a few. I'm guessing maybe from the Midwest, some of you from the Midwest. So back in the day, the ACT was very much a Midwestern test. It is now fully ensconced in the Northeast and on the West Coast. Completely viable test. Colleges look at the SAT and ACT equally. So the PSAT, purpose of the PSAT. I like to say the P stands for practice, and I think that's the best way to view it. Okay. It's also used for national merit. The junior year PSAT is used for national merit. And the best thing to take away from the PSAT is the feedback, the score report. I don't compliment the College Board very often, but one of the things they do very well is provide a detailed score report for the PSAT. And I say this with all tests. The practice tests should be looked at as feedback. So the natural inclination is you take a test, you look at the score, and then you feel a certain way. You feel good, you feel bad about yourself, whatever it is. But really, there's nothing you can do. The score is the score. Look at what that report is telling you. It's telling you where the strengths are, where the areas for development are. So that is the main purpose of the PSAT. You may also notice here that the PSAT is scored differently. So if you can remember back that far, when I was in school, it was 20 to 80. Right? You had a verbal score, you had a math score, it was 20 to 80 on each. And the idea of that PSAT score, it was supposed to predict how you were going to score on the SAT when you took it at the end of junior year or senior year. It's different now. So it's on a 160 to 760 scale. And what it's telling you is how you would score on the SAT at that point in time. Okay, so that's very different. So it's telling you how you would score on the SAT at that point in time. So if you get a 560 on the PSAT, it's basically saying, roughly speaking, if you were to sit down and take the SAT at that same time, you'd be getting a 560. Now, you'll say, okay, well, it only goes to 760, the SAT goes to 800. Do I just add 40 points? Absolutely not, okay? The reason the PSAT only goes to 760 is because it doesn't contain certain, it's not testing certain areas that the SAT does test. So certain higher level areas are not tested on the PSAT, so it can only go to 760. So if you get a 760, if you're one of those fortunate few, you get a 760, it doesn't mean you would score an 800 necessarily. You might, but they just can't tell because they're not testing those skills. SAT and ACT, the most important of the college admissions tests. And here are some different factors that college admissions officers consider when deciding whether to accept or reject students. And this was a survey done by NACAC, which is the National Association of College Admissions Counseling. They do this every year, and they ask admissions officers to rate factors, considerable importance, moderate importance, and you can see how it sort of shakes out. So those top three all have to do with grades and coursework, right? Grades in college prep, grades in all courses, strength of curriculum. And then the fourth thing there are admissions test scores. So if you sort of group those first three, which grades and coursework, the second most important factor are test scores. And then you can see some of the other things that are considered as well. But important to note that it's one factor of many. Yes, an important factor, but one factor of many. And this, of course, is a good time to mention test optional schools. So there are roughly 2,400 four-year degree granting institutions in the U.S. About a third of those, about 800, are test optional. But when you eliminate from those 800 open enrollment, religious training, vocational training, you're really left with about 20 to 30 selective test optional schools. Right, so Bates and George Washington, there's a whole list. So I did not mention, I assume everybody picked up a packet, and you will see a page number, lower left corner of each slide, and that will refer you to the appropriate page. This testing guide will contain everything I'm going to say today, plus a whole lot more. But there's a list of test optional schools, selective test optional schools on page 4. The other thing I want to say is that for students who apply to test optional schools, on average, over 50% of them submit test scores anyway. So if grades are the most important thing, why do we even need an SAT or ACT? And every now and again, a kid will ask that question. I always think it's a great question. Why do we take the SAT? Why do we take the ACT? Grades and course difficulty, as we all know, vary from teacher to teacher, from school to school, town to town, state to state, and that becomes a problem. So as an admissions officer, you get a B in honors chemistry at New Canaan High School versus a B in honors chemistry at some school in South Dakota. How do you determine what those means? And over time, there's been a fair amount of grade inflation, right? So a very high percentage of students across the country get A's and B's. So there's not a lot for admissions officers to look at and say, okay, well, that means that student's doing better, or that student's doing better. The SAT and ACT basically remedy those flaws, right? They provide a common baseline and a consistent curve. So for an admissions officer, if you get a 640 on the verbal portion of the test or the math portion of the test, they know what that means. They know sort of what percentile that puts you in, and that allows them to compare. Used properly, test scores and grades should be used together, and that is the way admissions officers use them. Okay, one complements the other. All right, so now we're going to get into SAT versus ACT, which is the bulk of this presentation. I'm going to start up here, and then I'm going to come down, okay? So at the highest level, I'm going to start with sort of dimensions of standardized testing, different characteristics. So that vertical axis, we're looking at an aptitude test versus a curriculum-based test. So when we all took the SAT, or when I took the SAT, it was very much an aptitude test. An aptitude test is a test designed to measure your inherent ability to do something. A curriculum-based test is designed to measure your mastery over a certain set of content. When I took it, again, SAT leaned more toward being an aptitude test. With this recent change, it is now very much a curriculum-based test, which is where the ACT is. So it's more in line with the ACT in that sense. The horizontal axis compares speed versus power. So the speededness of a test, and we've all been there, right? Like, time is running out, you've got 2 minutes to go, you're not quite finished, okay, pencils down. So the degree to which time is a factor is the speededness of a test. And that's built into all standardized tests. Then you have the power of a test, and the power of a test refers to the absolute difficulty of the individual test questions. Okay, so I was a math major. My final exam at Yale was like one question, prove this, had a lot of time. That's a pure power test, right? It's just this one very hard question. Speed versus power. That is the biggest difference now between these two tests. The ACT is a highly speeded test. The SAT, yes, it has degrees of speededness, but it's very much a power test. So if you give 10 students the ACT, and they've already taken the SAT, the majority of them are going to say, oh, I preferred the ACT. It felt better, felt more comfortable, felt more accessible. Well, that's because it's a curriculum-based test, right? It's more tied to what they're doing in school. But they're also going to say, I just wish I had more time. And that's the big difference. So I'm going to go through this comparison, and I think a lot of times you're going to be like, why am I even considering the SAT? Because the ACT is going to seem easier. But keep in mind, the biggest difference is the speed of the test. Subject tests, AP tests, those are pure curriculum-based tests. All right, this slide's a bit overwhelming. The main thing here is that these tests are both marathons. They're long tests, and kids aren't used to doing so. SAT with the essay, 3 hours and 50 minutes. ACT with the essay, 3 hours and 35 minutes. Endurance is really important, and the one thing I really push kids to do is take practice tests. It's one of the 3 main pieces of good test prep. Take practice tests. Take real practice tests, take them under time conditions. There are a lot of opportunities to do that. We do it at our office in New Canaan every single weekend. Opportunities to take free proctored practice tests. You would never go run a marathon without training for it. Same idea. Scoring, you guys know how the SAT is scored. 200 to 800. There are 2 sections. So they sort of went old school with this change a bit. So there's a verbal section and there's a math section. They don't call it verbal anymore. They call it evidence-based reading and writing. I preferred verbal. But evidence-based reading and writing, and there are 2 components to it. There's a reading component and there's a writing component. Then there's the math. That's 200 to 800. And then there's the essay. And you get 3 separate scores on the essay. Each score is 2 to 8. The ACT, you can see 4 sections. How many people know how the ACT is scored? Anybody? So it's 1 to 36, so a completely different scale. So you have 4 sections. You have the English, the math, the reading, and the science. Okay, science is one of those high-level differences between the SAT and ACT. 1 to 36, and then you get a composite score. And that composite score is the average of those 4 test scores. Okay, so your composite score is going to be something between 1 and 36. So if you got 28 on each section of the ACT, each of those 4 sections, you're going to get a 28 composite. And then college admissions officers use what's called a concordance table to compare ACT and SAT scores. Right? That's how they know what that 28 means on the SAT scale. Now, important to note, they're not publishing a concordance table for this new SAT and ACT probably until May of this year. Okay, so it's not going to come out for a while. Two high-level differences I'll point out. One, ACT has a dedicated science section. You can see that. As the new SAT does have science, but it's science questions spread throughout the entire test. And then you can see of the two math sections on the SAT, one of them is non-calculator. And I can tell you just anecdotally, kids who took the PSAT felt like the non-calculator section was challenging. Just because kids these days are very much used to using calculators. The tests from a content standpoint are very similar, right? You see a reading section. The English is very similar to the writing and language. They both have math, they both contain science, and they both have an essay. So with this change, they definitely have come more in line with each other from a content standpoint. Okay, so now we're drilling down. We're going to go section by section. I'll keep it at a certain level so you won't fall asleep on me. The writing and language, so let's just go back real quick here. So you see the writing and language on the SAT. The analog to that on the ACT is the English. So writing and language and English are the similar sections. They are very similar. The SAT really kind of stole this section from the ACT to add it to their new test. Basically, both of these tests are editing and revising tests. You're given a passage, and then you're asked to edit and revise that passage through multiple choice questions. I'll show you an example in a second. Both have a strong emphasis on grammar and editing. The biggest difference, again, I'm going to say this for every single section, is time. So on the ACT, you have 36 seconds per question. On the SAT, you have 48 seconds per question. And then here's an example of how it works. So this is a snippet of a longer passage. And then you're going to have multiple choice questions that correspond to numbered parts of the passage. And you have to determine, is it correct as written, or can it be improved in some way? So this is very much like what you want kids to do. It's like revising a paper. And then what I'm going to do is show you, this is the same section. So this is writing and language. And you see that graph. That's called a data graphic. So this new SAT contains data graphics. In fact, it's one of the themes of the new SAT, or data graphics. And they're spread throughout the test, not just the math, but they're in the writing and language, and they're in the reading sections. So they'll be part of passages. And then you'll be questioned on, is there consistency between the passage and the chart, or you may have a question directly on the chart itself. Okay, so data graphics, being able to read bar charts, line graphs, tables, all of that stuff is super important on the new SAT. Not so much on the ACT. Reading. So the reading on its face is similar. Again, I'm going to point out the time difference. So for the SAT, you have 13 minutes per passage. On the ACT, you have 8 3/4 minutes per passage. That's a big difference. SAT reading is more nuanced and requires a deeper understanding. You're going to have more inference-based questions, whereas the ACT is all about speed. Read it and pick out the facts. And I'm going to show you. So these are, so without the multiple choice answers, these are the question stems for both types, okay? So this is SAT. What can reasonably be inferred about gliding animals from the passage. So inferred, inference question. And then the question after that, which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? That's a new type of question with a new SAT. So citing evidence is another primary theme of the new SAT. So you have one question, you answer it, and then the next question is going to say, what evidence do you have to support that answer? So that requires sort of a deep understanding, deep reading, nuanced reading. The ACT, on the other hand, the passage points to which of the following. Much more about just going into the passage and finding the information. But you need to do it quickly. Okay? Other than that, I would say the reading passages are quite similar. Again, the SAT will have data graphics, which would be a slight difference. The math. See, biggest difference, SAT, narrow and deep. Okay, same kind of theme with the reading. So the math, overall content is similar. Basically, arithmetic through basic trig. But SAT math requires a deeper understanding of the math. The ACT, it's a wide array of topics tested at a pretty shallow level. Algebra is heavily emphasized on the new SAT. And as I mentioned, the SAT has a no calculator section. And again, sounding like a broken record, I'm sure, look at the time difference. So 83 seconds per question on the SAT, 60 seconds per question on the ACT. And here's an example. Here's a typical example of an SAT math question. And I point this out, one, because it's a word problem. So reading, heavily emphasized. Two, because it's a real world problem, very different from when I took the SAT, where you had questions, these sort of brain teaser type questions out of context. It's going to be very real world. It's a word problem. Numbers that aren't perfectly nice and neat. So that used to be an attribute of the old SAT, was numbers that were really easy to work with. But now they give you $99.95, 8% tax. And the other thing about this question is it's a linear algebra question. So linear equations within that algebra group is a huge point of emphasis. And this question you could also see on the ACT. This would be similar to an ACT question as well. And again, the other thing I should point out, there is that no calculator section on the SAT. Whereas the ACT, you get a calculator through the whole math section. Science. So science, I mentioned. ACT has a dedicated science section. SAT does not. But that doesn't mean the SAT doesn't have science. It has 21 science questions spread throughout the reading, the writing and language, and the math. Okay? They've sort of, again, when the SAT revised their test, they stole a lot of ACT things. And they decided not to add a dedicated science section. This was how they got science in there. Both tests rarely test your knowledge of science. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. So I can't remember a lick of science from when I was at the high school. I didn't take much science in college. But I can do very well on the ACT science section. And I can do very well on the SAT science questions. All of the information is in front of you. It's much more about reading through a maze of information and finding the relevant stuff. Okay, about 50 to 75% of what you see in an ACT science passage, they call them passages, is irrelevant. And I'm going to show you an example here. So this is an example of, and there would be words with this, there might be a table. it's a very intimidating. The first time you see an ACT science section, it's incredibly intimidating. And if you're not sort of prepared for it, and if you're a perfectionist, you're going to get yourself into trouble. So how many people here know what a lithosphere is? A asthenosphere, outer core, rigid mantle. Okay, so me too. I don't know what any of this stuff is. And most students, when they look at this, are not going to know what all this stuff is. But that doesn't mean you can't do the question. So I'm slowly going to take information away here. So the question is, and don't worry if you still can't get this, but according to figure one, the temperature of the outer core, so where's that outer core? Spot the outer core, spot that part of the graph, is approximately between, and then you see temperature sort of below in that graph area. So, okay, so that's not necessary. And then we're going to take that away. And we're slowly getting to the answer. So really, you just have, again, it's still probably a little bit, it's a complex chart or graph, but that's really all you need to do this question. Even if you don't, again, you don't have to understand all that other stuff, but that becomes a really hard question if you're trying to understand that graph. And that's really what ACT science is all about. It's also, again, broken record, a very fast section. The essay. So I love this guy's expression. I also love the fact that he's not facing the board. Which is, so both tests have essays. They are both optional, which is important to understand, but you really should not look at it as an optional portion of the test. If you're going to do these tests, do the essay. Some schools require them, some schools don't. Play it safe, do the essay. I can assure you that most schools will not weight the essay very heavily, if at all. Okay? So it's the least important of these tests, especially because for both tests, the essay is new. The ACT changed their essay, the whole SAT is new, and that essay is new. So from their perspective, it's one test item. It's like a single question, so they're not going to give it that much emphasis. They want to see how the data kind of plays out. All right? On the fringes, they might use it, right? They have a student, they're struggling to figure it out, blah, maybe the admissions essay, the application essay looks really polished, and they're like, is this? Then they might dive in and take a look at that essay. But for the most part, they will not be weighting these, so I don't want you to panic. The biggest difference, the ACT essay assignment asks you to write an argumentative essay, whereas the SAT assignment asks you to analyze an argumentative essay. So the SAT essay is, they'll give you like, a Martin Luther King speech or a JFK speech or something like that. It's a well-written argumentative piece. And then your job as a student is not to agree or disagree with the argument, but it's to analyze how the author crafts that argument. It's called rhetorical analysis. And it is a type of writing. I'm sure they do it at the high school here. I'm sure they do it in AP English, one of the AP English classes. It's a big, it's what they focus on, is rhetorical analysis. The ACT essay is different. You're given 3 perspectives on something, and then you have to write your own perspective, your own persuasive piece. So, are these the same tests? In some ways they are. And again, like I said, when the SAT was revising their test, they copied a lot of ACT elements. So 4 answer choices, all the questions now have 4 answer choices except for the math on the ACT. There's rights-only scoring, which is a great thing for kids. Okay, so rights-only scoring means there's no penalty for a wrong answer. So kids don't have to agonize anymore, should I guess or should I leave it blank? Guess, right? With 4 answer choices, you have a 1 in 4 shot at getting it right. And that assumes you can't eliminate anything. In most cases, you'd be able to eliminate an answer choice. So that's similar. The writing test is very similar to the ACT English test. Both are tests of achievement rather than aptitude, and both incorporate science. How are they different? SAT questions, on the face, take away time, in general, are going to be more challenging. It's going to take a little bit longer to get to the correct answer. SAT questions, sort of saying the same thing, going to require a deeper understanding. SAT, narrower focus of skills, but deeper. SAT questions, more, so this is sort of the offset to those 3 things, more time per question. In general, 30 to 40% more time per question. ACT, more straightforward. ACT requires instant recognition, tests a broader scope of skills, but not as deep, requires constant, rapid pace. Okay, so before the SAT changed, there were more differences to talk about. In short, the biggest difference is this speed thing, is this time thing. And that's, you know, as you think about your students, that's kind of the thing to think about. So the question is, you know, which test do you take? And I really wish there were a simple answer. And the reality is, they haven't even administered the new SAT yet. So we don't have enough evidence, enough data, enough anecdotes to say like, oh, this type of student should do this type of student should do that. The best way to do it, the best way to tell, and it's good practice, is to take a practice SAT, take a practice ACT, and see how things go. So the College Board has 4, and always use official tests, please. Don't use like a barren simulated practice SAT. Use the official tests. So College Board has 4 released SATs. They are going to release some more as they administer tests. And then the ACT, I think it's called the Real ACT Prep Guide. They have, Anthony, how many? 5. 5 official ACTs, and there are other official ACTs that are available as well. Take those practice tests. Again, you can take them for free in our office every weekend, often Saturday and Sunday. Timed, get a nice score report, see how you do. Very, very valuable experience. And it's not just, oh, let's get these numbers so we can compare. No, it's good practice. Like I said, these are long tests. The more you do it, the more you build up that endurance. The more you start to recognize question types. All right, I said I was going to do subject tests super quickly. I think subject tests lead to a lot of confusion, and I'm really going to leave that mostly to Cindy and her crew to help you with that. There are relatively few colleges that require or recommend subject tests. Generally speaking, they tend to be the more selective ones, so I know a lot of students probably from this group will be applying to some of those schools. But they're 1-hour tests. Try to highlight the different things here. Another thing you want to know is some colleges will accept the ACT test in lieu of SAT and subject tests. So the ACT can be a one-stop shop for some schools. The frustrating thing about college admissions, well, one of them, is that schools have very different policies. And so you really have to kind of look at each school to see what their policy is. Not all, given on ball test dates, there's a typo. Not all types of subject tests are given on all test dates. You can take up to 3 on a given test date. And they're administered on SAT dates, but you can't do both an SAT and subject tests. And in general, you want to do subject tests at the end, after your last class in that particular subject. So if you're going to do the U.S. history subject test, you think of it like a cumulative final exam, and you're taking U.S. history junior year, you would want to do that in May or June of junior year. Okay, so after that last class in that particular subject. You can do them in the fall, but again, you're not going to have that full year of learning that material. 22 schools require subject tests. So on page 39 in that testing guide, you can see different schools' policies. 16 schools recommend subject tests. Okay, so that's sort of SAT versus ACT, a little bit on subject tests. So when do you take these tests? These are dates for next year. You can see that both College Board and ACT give you many opportunities to take these tests. They are also introducing, I'm trying to think if you guys, yes, you guys, because it's August. So they're introducing an August test date. So August of 2017, is that right? So August of 2017, that'll be the first August test date for the SAT. That'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. But there are a lot of clamoring for a summer test date, and then it's a big question, does New Canaan offer an August test date? You know, do schools, anyway. So there will be that'll be out there. Most students should take the SAT or ACT twice. This is my recommendation. Should take the SAT or ACT twice in their junior year, and then you look at the fall on an as-needed basis. We always tell our students, you're going to take it in the fall. It's better to set that expectation than the reverse, right? But take an SAT or an ACT twice in junior year. I think that's pretty typical. What I like to see students do is figure out whether they're going to go down the SAT path or whether they're going to go down the ACT path. Keep it simple. You don't want to be spending your entire junior year and first half of senior year taking test after test. I mean, you're going to anyway, but you can minimize it. And if you can figure out SAT or ACT and go down that path, that is the most efficient, best way to do it. Now, it's not to say that something's not going to change. You know, you go down the SAT path, you take it for a second time, you're not where you want to be. Maybe you say, okay, you know what? I'm going to give the ACT in the fall of ACT a try in the fall of senior year. Couple of things on early testing. So I know the cocktail party circuit, you'll often hear test early and often, or you'll hear somebody tell a story about this kid that they heard and they started testing in 4th grade. You know, I'm exaggerating, but just a little bit. So my feeling is fall of junior year is too early. You have the PSAT then. It's too early for most students. It's too early. They're just not ready. These tests are not made to be taken that early. But there are 3 categories of students, I think, where it's okay to test that early. 1, higher scoring kids. What do I mean? 700 and higher type of thing. Okay, because you're ready at that point. If you're scoring 700, then you're ready. And you may be one of the fortunate few, you sort of knock it out of the park before you're halfway through junior year and you don't have to deal with it in the spring of junior year. That's rare. Certain Division I athletes, colleges will want to see test scores early. That's another exception. And then if you're doing junior year abroad, again, or junior spring abroad, you might have to test earlier. So those are really my 3 exceptions. Other than that, I don't think it makes sense for juniors to start any earlier than January. And I think January and February are perfectly appropriate starting points. But some kids aren't even ready then. And then maybe it becomes a March, April starting point. The more time in school, the more ready you're going to be for these tests, especially now that the SAT is a curriculum-based test. I will tell you, and I've been doing this for 30 years, kids score their best at the end of junior year and fall of senior year. Not every single time, but it should just make perfect sense, right? The more time in class, the more time in school, the better you're going to do on these tests. And if you test too early, you do run this varies from kid to kid, but you can run the risk of deflating confidence, right? You say, oh, I'm going to have my kid take it in October of junior year, and they're not ready, and they get a low score, a relatively low score, lower than what they expected. And maybe they're comparing it to some senior score they heard, and it's just, and then so you have to take that into consideration. If you want to do sort of a test run to see how you do, again, take a practice test. There's no reason not to do that. 2 terms. How many people have heard of score choice? Okay, so I'm just going to introduce a couple of terms here because you will hear them. So score choice is a testing agency policy. So that's policy set by College Board and ACT. Score choice basically says if you take the test multiple times, you can pick and choose which sittings you send to colleges. Okay, so you take the SAT 3 times and you bomb one of them, but your other 2 are solid, you can choose just to send those 2. Same thing on the ACT. Though that policy is a testing agency policy, not all colleges abide by score choice. So that's sort of the rub. So my alma mater, Yale, does not abide by score choice. So if you take the SAT 3 times, they want to see all 3 of those scores. Okay? So this is just, there are 2 columns here. It gives you a sample of colleges that require all scores and colleges where score choice is allowed. I'm looking at this now, it sort of implies that there's an even number on both sides. There's not. Colleges that require all scores, it's rarer. It's not as common. Most colleges do allow for score choice. How many people know what super scoring is? Okay, so super scoring is a college admissions policy. So what that says is if you submit multiple sets of scores, so we'll stick with the 3 SAT scores again. You take the SAT 3 times, you submit all 3. What they're going to do is super score that. They're going to take your highest, I call it verbal just because it's a mouthful, but evidence-based reading and writing, your highest verbal, and your highest math from those 3. Put those scores together, and that becomes your super score. So you can kind of see how it works here. So this student took it 3 times. The May math is the highest of the 3 math scores. The October reading and writing is the highest. And that becomes your super score. So that 1290 is the score that colleges consider. They say, okay, you got a 1290. You can trust in super scoring. You can have faith in super scoring. Okay? It's in their best interest as well as your best interest. It's in their best interest because of ranking systems like U.S. News and World Report. High SAT scores means they get ranked higher. You can have faith in super scoring. So score choice, super scoring, these two things together are things that have pushed people to test early and often, frankly, right? If there's score choice and there's super scoring, I might as well start in 4th grade. Well, for all the reasons I sort of gave before, I don't think that's true. And also remember, some schools are going to want to see all scores, right? So if you start testing really early, you've got some low scores, yes, you can have faith in super scoring, but they're going to see them all. So we're winding down here, I promise. So which tests, when do you take them? Talk a little bit about how do you prepare for them. All different ways you can do test prep. Okay, in general, start your test prep 6 to 15 weeks beforehand. It depends sort of what you're doing. And you want to build up to a test date. Work up to the test date, right? It's like training for anything. You want to be peaking at that time. There are 3 important pieces of test prep. There's content mastery, there's strategy, and there's practice tests. I've already talked a lot about practice tests. Content mastery, I don't know, 90% of it, which, you always hear, oh, it's how good a test taker you are. It's all about the tricks. It's all about, you need to understand the underlying content. You need to have a grasp of that content. You're not going to, if you don't, it's going to be a hard test for you. Strategy helps you get that little extra bit. Just that little extra bit. And it's important. I'm not saying it's not important, because it is, right? It maximizes sort of where you are content-wise. That's what I would say with strategy. And strategy is things like pacing, working backward on multiple choice questions, process of elimination, those types of things. But those are the 3 important elements of good test prep. Some guiding principles that we use. Most students are going to score the same no matter what test they take, right? So if I give students an SAT and an ACT, 7 or 8 out of 10 of them are going to score the same. But 2 or 3, there will be a significant difference. It's worth looking at. Prepping for one test helps you prepare for the other. Doesn't get you all the way there, but it gets you a long way there, especially now that the tests from a content standpoint are much closer. I mentioned this, students score their best at the end of junior year and fall of senior year. It is the rare student who is finished by January of junior year. Even high scores, I'm telling you. The number of kids we've seen, 760, 770 in January. Well, you can get higher, so they end up taking it again later. A good testing plan prioritizes schoolwork over test prep. Remember, I showed you the factors. Coursework and grades, most important from a college admission standpoint. And they will all tell you that. And they're not just saying it, it's true. Testing early and often is generally not sensible. And then this is the last slide. So most of these things I've covered, but preparing best practices. Work hard in school to develop underlying skills. Again, that's super boring, but it is true more now than ever, because they're curriculum-based tests. Have a sensible testing plan. Schedule prep so it leads up to the test date. Take a diagnostic test to identify areas for development. Assessment is key. So anytime you start a prep program, start with a diagnostic. Learn test-taking strategies, bolster skills. Take real practice tests. I can't emphasize that enough. Don't prep for SAT and ACT at the same time. I know I said there's overlap, and prepping for one will get you a long way home, but there are significant differences. It'd be like learning, I don't know, tennis and ping pong at the same time. Like, they're similar enough, but they're different enough. If you're going to end up prepping for both, prep for one, do it sequentially. Prep for one, and then kind of fill in the gaps, prepping for the other. And then I mentioned this, preparing for one test doesn't fully prepare you for the other, but it will give you a good head start. And then lastly, I always feel very hypocritical saying this at the end of this, but that is the main point. I mean, it's just a test. This is not life or death. It really is just a test. And you don't put your head in the sand, you do your best on it, but then the chips fall. So, Cindy, I don't know where we are time-wise, if we have time for a few questions, but yeah, I know that's a lot of information to digest, but I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have. Yes?
They've all taken the PSAT this fall, the 10th graders.
Yep.
If they take a practice ACT, in their minds, can you compare that 10th grade score to an ACT test like practice?
So that's a good question. You know, so your students took the PSAT in October. Those scores are back. If you go take a practice ACT and you get a score, can you compare them? Roughly you can, but they're actually not coming out with a concordance table until May. So officially, it's hard. Like, it won't be exact. Like, we actually created a derived concordance table that you could use that will give you, but you just have to understand it's not perfect.
So it's about how they score, not about how they feel about the test?
Both. Another really good point. So, because often, like I said, most times kids are going to score the same, which is basically just saying the tests are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then the next question is, well, which one did you prefer? Right? If you prefer the ACT because it feels more accessible, all that stuff, great. Or if the time is overwhelming. So yeah, it's both of those things. Yeah.
What do you recommend? I saw that the 6 to 15 weeks is test prep before the first part of the test. If you sit for the test, let's say January, February, and then you're going to sit again, what's the reset, or what do you do between that one and sitting for the next one?
Yeah, so if you did prep for the first one, then you have all those tools and skills in theory, right, for the next one, but stuff goes out. So I think it totally depends on the student. Like, I've told kids, if you have this super motivated kid, you know everything you need to know, and then you just lay out a little game plan. Take a practice test, review that, you know, so you can kind of do it that way. Most kids, they're busy enough, they're not going to do that. So it's a matter of doing a few sessions just to get those wheels spinning again and get back in the game. Yeah.
Back to the SAT subject test, for the schools that require them, how many are there?
So, yeah, most schools require, the ones that require are going to require 2. Yeah. So if you're going to, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
What percentage of kids take the SAT versus the ACT? It is different in the game.
I don't know, Cindy, do you know what percentage take the SAT versus ACT here?
Here, I think we're at perhaps around 30% of our kids up till now. This year, I don't really know because it's
30% with
Take ACT.
ACT, I'm sorry.
anything.
But I think this year, we're going to see a much bigger difference. So we haven't gone through this year, but in terms of the spring, I think we'll see a lot of ACT takers this year. So I'm guessing nationally, more kids take the ACT. So
Do you know what percentage take both here?
I don't know.
Okay, yeah. Don't know, but nationally, more kids take ACT than SAT. Yeah. In the back there.
With the advent of the state mandated SAT, if you have a child who decides to focus on the ACT, how are you handling advising them about, suppressing the score or,
So you need to, the first thing you need to know, there's score choice, right? So for most schools, if you're going to focus on the ACT and that's where your best score is, and you take the SAT, and not this year, but next year, March 2nd, whatever the date is, you wouldn't have to send it, right? So it's only at those schools that are requiring all scores, and that's a fairly small list, you'd have to send it. you can cancel your scores. You know, if you feel like you go into that test and you bomb it, or you didn't try it, you can within, I don't know what the time, 2 days? Within 3 days, you can call and say, I want to cancel that.
Is the certificate of which is dwelling of schools that require you to send all your schools?
I'm sorry.
Is the list of schools that require all scores growing?
No.
No, yeah.
I think it's diminishing. But then again, you always have to remember 99.9% of colleges are looking for your best scores. As Charlie said, you know, it's in their best interest to report the best scores. You know, so there's no reason to worry about it if it's a lower score. They're going to go for your best scores.
With PSAT coming up the fall junior year, and the child might study for PSAT, will it be a good strategy or bad strategy to just go and take SAT around the same time, let's say October, since he or she has been studying for PSAT anyway?
So the question is, if you're prepping for the PSAT, is it a good strategy to take the SAT at that time? You know, I would say my caveat sort of applies. So again, if you're a higher scoring kid, yes, yeah. Though if you're still in that boat, again, if you're a lower scoring kid, I just think there are risks. It's just no need to do it at that point. These are just my opinions.
I mean, to be honest, you wouldn't prep for the PSAT necessarily unless you were thinking you might get national merit recognition, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big, you know, there are two instances where I would say you might prepare for the PSAT, and I know this will fall on a lot of deaf ears. One, I think if you are a potential national merit candidate, it's very small. And then the second would be if you're really struggling with a lot of the underlying skills and just in general are going to need more prep, and you want to. So there's that, and then if you have I mean, what I've seen is like we'll often do like 2 PSAT prep sessions with a student, just because the student's anxious about the test and they just want to feel more in control of it, and so that would be the other reason. But in general, again, the P is for practice. It's a practice test. I just want to stay over here just for a bit if there are any. Yeah.
What do you think the College Board went from ability to curriculum-based, and do you think we'll ultimately end up with just one test?
So the first part of your question is it's a business decision, really. They were losing a lot of market share to the ACT, and the test as an aptitude test. So I mean, Connecticut's a great example. As an aptitude test, Connecticut would not have contracted with the College Board to have that state mandated test because it didn't align well enough to state standards, whereas the curriculum-based test does. So by creating this curriculum-based test, they're now in the they've got this huge market, you know, all of Connecticut. They just got Michigan, I mean, New Hampshire, I think. So, and ACT, because it was a curriculum-based test, had a bunch of states already. So there was a business decision. Will there be just one test? I don't know. I really don't. I don't think so. I don't think so.
Hi, I was a little late, so please forgive me if you already went over this, but I'm still a little confused about the you're saying, you know, kind of take one or the other, the ACT or the SAT, and take your test prep, practice test to decide which one. Are there schools that are looking for both scores? Do kids take both?
Yeah. So definitely, schools don't need both sets of scores. They'll say send in the SAT or send in the ACT. There are students who send in both if you feel like that's going to make you look good in some way. But schools don't need both. So to your, and then what was the second part of your question was?
So I guess I was a little bit confused about, because some people take both, and I was wondering why. And do, you know,
So-
maybe some schools are looking for both, or
Right, so some-
is there an advantage to
Yep.
taking both?
So some people take both and they'll do it for different reasons. One, like you may have a plan initially that says, okay, I'm going down the SAT path. but then something, you're like, that's not working out as well as I wanted it to, or I still think I can do better. So then you go, in the ACT, you may go and say, okay, I'm going to take the ACT also. And I can tell you there's some people probably in this room are like, my kid's going to take both SAT and ACT, because it's just throwing more darts at the board type of thing. My opinion, again, there's no one right plan. My opinion is grades and coursework most important, right? So if you spend all your time taking tests, preparing for tests, it goes against that, and it's a very real thing. How you do in school is the most important thing. I also just think it's a misappropriation of the way you should be spending your time, but yeah. Yep. Oh. So, I'm sorry.
The SAT is super scored for colleges, but as of right now, the ACT is not. Do you see that changing at all, just with how popular the ACT is getting?
Did you talk about was it super
Super scoring, yeah.
So the SAT, basically all colleges will super score the SAT. Not all colleges will super score the ACT. I think that list is growing, schools that will super score the ACT. It's a pretty big list, actually. And I do think it's kind of has to. Yeah. Sorry.
So there are no schools that prefer SAT over ACT. They'll take either one. There's not one that's more highly.
Correct.
So they'll take either.
Yeah, that's like a generation. It's hard to kind of wrap your brain around that, but yeah, that's absolutely the case. Okay.
Great, well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.